Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi Stella, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm doing well. So today we had Dr. Hakeem on again. This is the second time. We had him on originally in February of 2022. And so it was really great to catch up with him and just hear a little bit more. He definitely took the opportunity to rib us both, you for your background and me for not being able to read his book. So it was a fun conversation. Of course, he always has a lot to say.
Yeah, the thing about Az is he brings a lot to the party. He brings a lot to the conversation. So the last time he gave us so much, it's been repeated and tweeted and reposted so often. His kind of analysis of how RODG is kind of goth Mark 5 type thing. And it was really good and really well thought out. He's a great brain. And this time he did something equally interesting, which was a kind of an analysis of gender dysphoria. And he has a very different view of it, I'd say, than most people. You know, his view around AGP and transvestic fetishism is not what most people think. And I think it's well worth listening to. I'm a lot less sure of myself, and I'm certainly not anything like as certain about it, because I think we're still figuring it out. But I do think it was really interesting because there's a few people now who have very certain views, and they've got frameworks, and they're charging ahead with them. And honestly, I think it all adds to the discourse. And Az's is really well thought out. And it made me pause and think about things and think, I'm not sure where I'm at with this, but this is really thought-provoking.
Yeah, and I mean, I think three things that really caught our eye. First of all, we had what I think for you and I both was this like mind-blowing epiphany when we started talking about what happens when an autistic way of thinking meets queer theory. You got to listen to that part. It was amazing. Yeah. And you asked him this really interesting question. You said, as a clinician in the UK, what do you think should happen to GIDS? And what did he say?
He said, close it down.
Close it down.
Nix the whole lot.
Yeah, which I was surprised to hear that. And he said it with a really strong, definitive kind of place. And then we touched on something that I hadn't heard of before. Maybe you can explain this concept of the overvalued idea and what light that can shed on gender dysphoria.
Yeah, this is an old idea. It's over 100 years old. But the whole concept of the overvalued idea, I know Mia Hughes is doing great study in it, but Az really lit upon it as it's a better understanding of what's going on with trans ideation in general, is to understand the concept of the overvalued idea. I think it's Karl Wernicke who's originally the person who first brought in this theory of the overvalued idea. And it's different from a delusion, and it's different from mental illness. So Az gives us a great analysis of that, and I think there's a lot to be said about that in the future still.
Yeah, so just briefly, Dr. Hakeem is, of course, a distinguished psychiatrist and psychotherapist. He has an extensive career spanning over 2 decades. He was educated at the Rydal School and University College London. He completed his medical and psychiatric training at top London and Glasgow hospitals. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and has specialized in forensic psychiatry and psychotherapy. He's a patron of the LGB Alliance and a member of the Clinical Advisory Network on Sex and Gender, which is CAN-SG. And of course, he's the author of 2 books, Trans, Exploring Gender Identity and Gender Dysphoria, which was from 2018, and his latest book, which he highly recommends, almost as he recommended it above his first book. He said he was much more bold in the D-Trans book, which was nice to hear. And he made fun of me for being unable to produce a copy of it on command, as Stella had, called D-Trans When Transition is Not the Solution, published in 2023. So we hope you enjoy this conversation.
We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show.
Hi, Stella, and welcome back as Hakeem to the show.
Hello.
How's it going, Az? Good to see you.
Thanks for having me again.
So we had you on in 2022, and about a year ago, actually, your second book, D-Trans, came out, which you are holding there. Perfect. Stella has hers. I don't know where my copy is. I have two bookshelves in this house, one behind me and one elsewhere. No, I do have one. I do. But we wanted to ask you about, you've obviously got some ideas about categorizations and how to really understand the variation within populations of people who choose to transition and then, of course, detransition. So what have you learned, and what can you tell us about people who detransition?
Well, before the detransition, let's talk about the transition. So I had a unique experience in that for the time I was running my specialist gender dysphoria adult psychotherapy service, I was seeing people for an hour or an hour and a half if they're in a group every week, some of them for over 10 years. So this is more clinical contact than any other clinician would have had with them before or subsequently, and probably more clinical contact with anyone with gender dysphoria that anyone's had really in this country. And what became clear was that whilst each person may present saying, I'm the wrong sex, I need to have a sex change, what became clear was that there were distinct categories. And we previously knew that these distinct categories existed, but now they're all called trans, which is really confusing. So you have one group, which are the transsexuals, and these are the people who believe or buy into the belief that they should be the other sex. And they're a small number of people. Then you've got a huge number of people, which are what we call transvestites. And they know deep down that they're not the other sex, but they get something out of dressing up. And you can divide them into the fetishistic transvestites and the non-fetishistic. The non-fetishistic, they get some reward from dressing up. So classically, Mervyn Glasser, in his 1977 paper, Analysis of a Transvestite, he talked about the young boy who'd grown up with a smothering, overpowering, claustrophobic mother, and then by triumphing over her, he could put his mother on and take his mother off at will. So that was his way of overcoming the trauma, and all perversions have a root in trauma. So the trauma of the smothering, suffocating mother was overcome by putting on and taking off mother at will, the external vestiges, the trans vestiges. And then for those of them who get sexually turned on, they would do that and they'd masturbate whilst doing it. So they needed their penis in order to masturbate. They had no intention of getting rid of their penis. And then there's another group, which is very, very small, which are the autogynephiles, the AGPs. And what's clear from looking at gender critical Twitter, for example, is that lots of gender critical people confuse fetishistic transvestites with AGPs. And everybody now who's wandering around in lacy underwear as a man on the street is called an AGP, but they're not. The AGP, the autogynephile, is a man who is sexually turned on by the idea of having female genitalia and breasts. So it's nothing to do with dressing up. So they're the ones that are fantasizing and getting turned on by the idea of having a vagina and breasts. The people that you see wandering around in various states of, Anne Summers garb in the streets and trying to get into women's spaces and getting really excited by it, they're the fetishistic transvestites. For them, the fetish is being in a woman's space, whether that's her clothing, her spaces, Germaine Greer talked about it as almost like a rape. And you can think of it as a societal rape, because they're not getting inside the woman, but they're getting inside the woman's space. And their determination to get inside the woman's space is a bit like social rape. because they're fully intact men with penises. They're getting excited, and that's the fetish. And then you've got the fourth category, which is the ROGD kids. These are the kids who suddenly come home from school, say, I'm trans and non-binary. And these are the ones that I say are a youth subculture. There's nothing medical or psychologically pathological about them. They are just goth Mark 5. So they just look just like I looked when I was 16, or any punk looked in the 70s. They look subversive, but they're just being cool because all their friends are. And there's, this sudden explosion of non-binary trans in schools as soon as one cool non-binary looking person turns up. They haven't caught it like COVID. It's a subculture, but because there's no music attached, we don't see it as that. So those are the four groups as I see it.
Okay, that's fascinating. And there's a lot of questions I'm sure we both have. I'd like to ask you, because there's so many debates happening in, the debates around gender and gender identity and feminism. And I think there's a lot that you said which would poke big holes into some of the common arguments that we hear online. One of the things I'd love to ask you about is there such a thing as an ROGD boy? And tell us about that profile of kid.
ROGD just means you suddenly come to the conclusion that you're non-binary or trans, and you didn't have any history of it before. And, what I've said is, and everyone's sick of me saying this story, when I went to school in the 80s and Jenny turned up, I was doing a podcast recently and they said that my soundtrack should be Jenny Was a Friend of Mine by the Killers, because I say this story. So when Jenny turned up with back-combed hair and, purple lipstick and eyeliner, we're going, oh my God, you're so cool. What are you? You're a goth. Within weeks, the whole of this North Wales public school were goths. And I had vertical hair for, until it left me. We looked very subversive and, non-binary, but it was nothing about gender. We were just goths, and, my trajectory of goth is, it starts off with punk, and Mark 1 goths were the ones who liked the post-punk goth bands like me, Bauhaus. Then Mark 2 goths, they're a bit happier, so they like The Cure. Mark 3 goths were sort of verging into shoegaze territory. Mark 4 goths were emos, where they discovered self-harm. And then Mark 5 goths, because they coincide with social media replacing music, are the non-binary trans people. But because it's no longer about music, social media has taken the role of music. Because in Generation X, it was all about the music. When social media came along, it's all about your social media profile, how many likes you've got, all that sort of stuff. Music, kids now, they listen to music, but they're not as into it as Generation X were. So Goth Mark 5 is just non-binary trans. But unfortunately, they have parents who've seen documentaries on the BBC and think that their children are trapped in the wrong body, and they march them down the castration pathway. And like I said recently, castration is the new backcombing.
But okay, that's pretty devastating to hear that, because knowing the parents and the kids who are in the middle of this, they're in awful mental pain, and they're really caught up in something really absorbing, and it's taken them over. I wonder, with those goth Mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, did it get progressively more dysfunctional, or because these are really distressed kids.
The subculture is all about angst and subversion and fighting back. So in the mix, you will have some angst. And if I was held back from my eyeliner and my hairbrush and my hairspray as a goth and told I wasn't allowed to wear black or look I wanted, I'd be furious. So if you're saying to these children, you can't have this identity, then they're going to be furious. But because they then conflate it with being trans, and they then look into the whole trans route, and they become that is the subculture. So you're trying to remove them from this subculture, which is actually a medical issue. They fight back. So okay, so there might be distress, but treat the distress. Don't castrate them. That's an easy way out. Saying these kids are distressed, let's castrate them.
Okay, what about a boy who is similar to what you described? A kid shows up in his grade that is identifying as trans. He's a bit enamored by this kid. Perhaps it's a girl who's non-binary and she's kind of hot and sexy and he likes her, and he suddenly is like, well, I could be trans if that'll get your attention. Like, very much like what you're describing. What if we also discover, for example, that he's been buying lacy underwear on Amazon, and also looking at some porn that has some feminization themes. Some people in the current debates are saying, well, that kid is AGP or has traits of AGP or has nuggets of AGP. And I've said at times, like, perhaps these feelings, these autogynephilic feelings, can exist on some sort of a spectrum. It seems like maybe that's not your perspective, but analyze that scenario for us in your view.
Yeah, okay, so like I said, there's 4 groups. So the vast majority will be youth subculture for RODG. A huge amount will be transvestites and some transsexuals. So within the kids, the male who's dressing up, he might be a transvestite because there may be something that has led him to get excited about dressing up in his mother's or sister's clothes or buying them. So it affords him something. So it's not about may not about being non-binary or trans. It might be about he's found that wearing cross-sex clothing or clothing that he thinks is cross-sex clothing makes him feel something which rewards him. So he may be a transvestite, and transvestism often starts off quite young. So it's if he's dressing up and getting excited by the dressing up, he's necessarily a transvestite, not an AGP. This is the confusion between AGPs and fetishist transvestites. AGP is overly used. AGP has nothing to do with clothes. It's just getting excited by having a vagina and breast, not about clothes. So the person who's excited by clothes and excited about getting into women's spaces, women's clothes, women's anything is a transvestite, not an AGP. AGP wants to have a vagina and have breasts.
So
you're saying who want to get into spaces of fetishist transvestites.
So you're saying AGP is an anatomical fixation.
Fetish. Yeah, it's an anatomical fetish. So their fantasies are not about them dressing up. Their fantasies are them having a vagina or them having breasts. It's very, very, very rare. Obviously I've seen loads of them, but they're distinctly different from the transvestite. The transvestite is all about the clothing. And in my first book, I described 11 different types of transvestite. You've got the transvestite who fantasizes that they're the opposite sex. You get the transvestite who is excited by not being seen as the opposite sex, so they may have a more masochistic quality to them, so they get jeered at by children going, oh, you're a man, and they may start off feeling emasculated, but then feel empowered as a man, because look, these people are telling me I'm a man, I don't really feel like I'm a man, but they are confirming that I'm a man. You get people who have a fetish about the texture of the clothes on their skin. So lots of men have this thing about tights or lace. So there's tons of variants. I identified 11 different subtypes of the transvestite, and there's always been far more transvestites than there have been transsexuals or AGP. You know, that shop Transformation on the Euston Road, where turning men into beautiful women was the tagline, I think. And you'd go there as a man, and they'd dress you up for the day, and they'd all look like Hyacinth Bouquet or something out of some drag show, and you'd wander around London for a day, then go back like Mr. Ben, dressing up and going home again.
But I remember reading about like different types of autogynephiles, and there was, anatomical, there was behavioural, there was transvestic autogynephile, and there was physiological, as in they wanted to be breastfeeding or whatever they wanted to be. You know what I mean? But there was the transvestic autogynephile. That's how I read it.
But autogynephile is, you consider it as a subset within transvestism, not transvestism the subset of an autogynephile. So that the fetish of womanhood would be in transvestism, and for those for whom it's not about the clothes at all, but just having the body parts, is AGP, which you can either academically argue whether it's a subset within fetishes transvestites or a separate grouping, but it's a much smaller grouping than the massive transvestism. But we don't talk about transvestites anymore because the activists want to give weight to the trans debate, and by enlisting a huge horde of people that are irrelevant but happen to be wearing women's clothes helps them. It made you speechless.
No, Stella is blowing her nose. Poor thing. She's feeling sick.
I can do the whole podcast by myself. I can just carry on talking and just.
Well, I want to ask you. You were working in the field for many years. Remind me, what years did you start working?
I started in 2000. I started in 2000, and everyone's saying, "Why on earth are you interested in this area?" And I was going, because nobody's thinking about it. This is madness. And what I came to realize was the madness wasn't located in the individual. the individual was confused, a fetishist,
Oh, yeah.
autistic, or had trauma. The madness was located in everyone around them, their families, their employers, society. The madness is the response societally we have to them.
Good for you.
Why do you think that is? Is it because it's so, sorry, Stella, do you think it's because it's just so hard to understand that people revert back to these kind of platitude statements like trapped in the wrong body or whatever? Like, why do you think society is so vulnerable to just having a superficial understanding of these phenomena?
I think it's because of the vociferous backlash and because they've got themselves protected by piggybacking on another group, gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, who have earned through hard work their protective status. So almost like a cuckoo in someone else's nest, Stonewall and whoever implanted T onto the LGB surreptitiously by sleight of hand. And then, so they piggyback on all the social political understanding that we have about sexuality, whereas it's not a sexuality apart from the fetishists. And so people daren't sort of critique it that way. And also, if you think about the transsexuals, not the transvestites, the transsexuals, because my argument is all male transsexuals are autistic, so they typically are, quite sort of intelligent in other ways, and they are prone to having autistic meltdowns if you don't agree with them. So a bit like the autistic child who, the fish fingers are touching the baked beans, they have this massive screaming nuclear fallout emotional response. You get that with autistic people. So if you're seen to be not going along with what they want, they have this massive autistic meltdown, either in the street or in your face, or by writing lots of angry letters to everyone and making everyone's lives hell. So lots of people have learned from that not to even go there because they want an easy life and they don't want to have loads of complaints and stuff. So over time, that's what's happened.
The fetishistic transvestites, from your point of view, they seem to be the most kind of problematic to society because they're trying to gain access to female spaces, if I'm right.
Well, there's two problems. The autistic transsexuals are problematic because they're vociferously angry and they write lots of emails trying to kill everyone off that's dared not agree with them, and they get people cancelled from their jobs and all that sort of stuff. So the autistic, angry, autistic meltdown transsexuals are a problem, but the transvestites are a problem because they try and use whatever they can to try and get into women's spaces, rapaciously invade women's spaces by the pretense of being a woman, whereas they're men with penises and testicles. And it's obvious that they're not, but they get something out of being in those spaces. We've all seen the videos on Twitter of these sort of very self-satisfied transvestites who are gloating about getting into the women's changing room and getting very sexually excited. This triumph over that. So that's the problem. So there's problems from the transsexual and the problems from the transvestite society.
And what about the non-fetishistic transvestite? How are they doing in society, and how are we managing with them?
The ones
and
that
how
don't
are they
really
managing with us?
They don't want to draw attention to themselves. So they either do it at home without going outside while doing the vacuuming, or they just do it quietly, and they fear being seen, and they try and do it surreptitiously. So it's the more fetishistic ones that are more, that get more excitement and want to sort of invade.
As it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but it sounds like you've described these categories in a way that I know your work reflects years and years of seeing patients, and so you're noticing patterns, but it sounds like you're saying these are these intractable, innate aspects of the person? Are these things, can they change over time? Are they amenable to treatment? And does the culture impact somebody's interpretation? Like I'm imagining, the non-fetishistic transvestite at home vacuuming in a dress, but then maybe coming across a news story or a Reddit thread and then going, well, maybe I can take this outside. Like, are these things amenable to change from the environment and things like that?
Totally. I mean, my service was individual and group therapy, and I found the group therapy to be by far the best because the therapy was by everyone in the group, not just by me. So you had people; they all thought that they were in the wrong sex, apart from the detransitioners and the regretters who knew they weren't, and they were able to compare and contrast and critique each other from coming from a similar yet different stance and challenge it in a way going, hang on, that doesn't make you a woman just because you're doing this, or hang on a minute, you're just getting excited by that. So that was far more powerful. And they would come to the group with very gendered ideas of what life was, a bit like being French, where everything is le or la, and they would talk about things being masculine and feminine, not just the obvious things, but everyday items would be masculine or feminine, or how they did or said things. And that was critiqued by each other, going, this is ridiculous. What do you mean you did this in a masculine way? You did that in a feminine way? And my premise in the group was there's no such thing as gender. There's biological sex. Gender is a social construct. It's a bit like religion. You can invest as much or as little into it as you want. But if it becomes problematic, don't let it ruin your life. Just de-invest from gender and just be you and be whatever you want to be without thinking that you're breaking any rules. The autistic people were really slavishly adherent to rules, because autistic people are. And the transvestites were excited by the rules, and they were sort of excited by transcending them. And the I talk to my patients about gender confident and gender underconfident people, and the gender confident people were just normal people who thought, well, these are your frameworks. I'm going to subvert them. If you think I look female or you're not sure, then that's your problem. Whereas the gender underconfident people were really trying to learn all the rules and abide by the rules in this sort of autistic way of thinking. Therefore, a woman is this. Because what I found is, for my transsexual patients, and I've seen so many, not a single one could convey to me what they meant by feeling that they're the wrong sex. They would only ever talk about descriptions of external appearance, because for the autistic person, they struggle to work out the internal mind of someone. They struggle enough with their own. So whenever I said, what is a woman? Well, women have long hair, they have lipstick, they have makeup, they have dress. No, that's what they look like. What is it? How do you know you're what is it? Oh, well, I'm emotional, I like cooking. No, that's a behavioral thing. What? And they couldn't, not one of them could say what it was to be a woman, or vice versa, a man. They would just talk about stereotypic behaviors or what they look like, which of course isn't a woman. So it's almost like blackface or imitation. And if you can imitate to the point that people believe you're that, therefore you are that.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask you, as the way you're living in the UK and it's post-Cass, and there's a kind of a struggle for a kind of a power grab going on between the two camps. It looks like, for me, it looks like that. If you were in charge of the service, what would you do?
Shut it down.
Yeah, go on. Tell us what you would do. What would you actually do?
Down, because there's no such for kids or for adults.
Gender, yeah. How would you manage trans issues?
I would shut it down because gender doesn't exist. We've invented this condition, which is a false proxy solution, which people are asking for, and the outcomes, which nobody knows because nobody follows them up. The outcomes depend on how autistic you are. So if you really believe that all a woman is someone with long hair, makeup, and wears dresses, and you do that, and you really believe that people see you as a woman, then you may be happy. But the less autistic people, they began after some years to realize, actually, there's more to a woman maybe than this, and people are realizing that I'm not a woman, and that's when they regret. So there's different types of regret. Yeah. So this is I'm finally coming around to what Sasha asked me originally. When I said that. So you've got the transsexual who isn't that autistic, who then realizes some years later that they've gone from gender dysphoria to transgender idealism, to transgender euphoria, to transgender regret. And they start off with a sense of inauthenticity about their own gender, and they end up with a sense of inauthenticity about their new gender. So that's one sort of regret, the transsexual regret. The transvestite or the autogynephile regret is the the excitement, the sexual excitement from doing all this is gone as soon as they're castrated, and they wake up going, "What have I done? I don't want this." So the unfortunately, a lot of the autogynephiles I saw were ones who had thought, "Okay, I need a sex change because I'm obviously think I'm a woman because I'm so excited about this." They didn't sort of clock that their excitement was sexualized, even though they were masturbating furiously at the thought of having a vagina. And they didn't want to wait, 2 years for a gender clinic. So they got themselves on a plane. They went to Bangkok. They booked themselves in for surgery, and they woke up. And immediately they woke up, they regretted having a neo vagina fitted. And that's
Can I
the
ask,
classic regret.
were those patients on T blockers and estrogen for some time, or not necessarily? Because I mean, even that is a chemical castration, which definitely tips the balance of like, how arousing is this? So that's interesting too. Tell us about that.
So some were, but some weren't. One of my patients said, I want to become a woman. Sorry, I wanted to become a woman the way that God made them. And God gives girls vaginas before they grow breasts. So I want to get a vagina and then take hormones and grow breasts. So that was his logic.
Wow.
And one of them said, he wasn't sure. And he thought, well, am I doing the right thing? And on this plane to Bangkok, and he got there, and he said to the surgeon, "Look, I'm just not sure. Am I doing the right thing?" And the Bangkok surgeon said, "Look, I've booked the theatre now. You're going to have to do it." And so he felt so bad, he did it. We woke up regretting it. I mean, that obviously that surgeon hadn't gone on a communication skills course that medical students now go on.
Jeez, that's devastating. That's devastating. I mean, yeah, I mean, we've heard a story. I can't remember who it was, but somebody told us a story of like being in the operating theater or whatever it's called, and just like feeling a lot of doubt. Was that Forrest, Stella? I can't remember who it was, but anyway, and they just felt like, well, I'm here, I already paid or whatever, like this very almost like logistical reason to do this massive, massive thing. Oh, okay. So then what are you noticing in terms of, you raise autism, and I'm curious. I mean, obviously there's overlap. Like I've certainly worked with patients that have touches of all these categories, I think. And you go ahead.
Sorry, so I'm not very good at wasting my turn, am I? I think it's an ADD thing. So the really autistic transsexuals are veering towards the asexual. So they don't really get sex. It's this icky thing that other people do. They don't. So those definitely are not overlapping with the fetishists because it's nothing sexual at all. They don't really get why people have sex. If there's an overlap, they'd have to be very mildly autistic and more the fetishistic ones. So those are an overlap. And also the overlap between the fetishistic transvestites and the autogynephiles. So the ones who seem to have the better outcome are the really autistic ones, and for them it's not a sexual thing. The ones who have the worst outcomes are the ones who are either not very autistic and transsexual, or the ones who are actually transvestites or autogynephiles.
What about homosexual transsexuals? Where do they fit on all this?
Yeah, so there was some of my biological males and a lot of my biological female patients, and there was I talk about the risk factors are internal risk factors is one's own autism, and the external risk factors is the homophobia that you may find yourself in, which you then internalize. So there's a lot of girls who, they fancy girls, but they didn't know any lesbians. There's no role models. I said when I was saying this to Hilary Cass when she was interviewing me, I said, there aren't any role models for young lesbians. She said, "What about Sandy Toksvig?" And I said, "No, that's not a role model for young girls.
I don't know who that is.
That'll put you off."
I'll have
It's
to
a
look her
really
up.
boring person on television in the UK that nobody wants to really
Okay.
a cool child. But there were loads of trans male, social influencers, and they're all like big, strong, hairy with a beard. And, would you rather be this obsolete lesbian thing that I've never heard of that's like, what are they? Or would you be this trans masculine, and they're missold this idea that they can be a man because they can't. Yeah, sorry.
What about the classic, the Ray Blanchard homosexual transsexual? How do you classify them?
I mean, the there was an autistic person I was assessing, and I said, but you're a biological man, and you're sexually attracted to men, so surely that just means you're gay, doesn't it? And he said, no, I'm not gay because I don't like gay bars and gay clubs and gay music. And his understanding was to be gay meant you like gay clubs, gay bars, gay music, and I don't like that, therefore I'm this. And that was the autistic way. I was saying, look, it's not about the music and he couldn't get that it was. He said, I don't like that lifestyle. It's like, well, so.
You said something earlier. I think you said all male trans are autistic.
All male transsexuals, not transvestites, all male transsexuals are on it. So I looked at my population sample over the years I was doing it, and all of the males were autistic. And then I wrote down some quotes of what people had said. Finding it really.
And not all the females.
No, the females. So the things that people would say were. I'm not a man because all men have short hair and wear suits. I want to have long hair and wear interesting clothes. Someone else said, I was in Body Shop and I chose the grey wash bag and not the pink one. That was a woman. I like planes and cars, therefore I must be male. I don't like football or sports, therefore I should be female. I'm in touch with my emotions and I like looking after the home and cooking, so therefore he should be female. I prefer the company of women or men, delete as appropriate. And so they have these brand associations, brand male, brand female, that they gravitate to. What they cannot envisage is that they could be subversive and be a certain sort of male or female and break the rules that they see. With the rules are nonsense, there are no rules, but they believe that there are rules, but they also can't break them. So the activists say, oh, we're being subversive. They're not being subversive at all. They're the least subversive. If they were subversive, they'd be like Boy George was in the 80s, and they'd present how they were and not pretend to be anything else. The confusion will be in other people's minds while they're not purporting to be any other sex than they are.
I think that this is really important because if we were to take this conversation out of the context of the year 2024, and let's say we're having this conversation in the year like 1985 or something, before the boom of trans influencers and all of these trans activist organizations, the statements you just read to us would clearly indicate a rigidity of thinking, an inability to see the flexibility in self-expression, hard time with gray areas very clearly. However, what you just said, some of that is almost verbatim the stuff put forward by people like Gendered Intelligence and all of these activist groups and some of the, health ed curriculums that we see in schools. So in a way, I'm curious, do you think that today lots of kids who maybe don't have necessarily autistic traits, but maybe they're real passionate about social justice activism, they just want to read all the definitions and do all the things, would you say that's the ROGD kid? Those are those kids, right? Just to clarify your framework.
Because those are, whatever, going back to subculture, whatever was associated with your band you liked, you supported. So if these are the associated characteristics of trans non-binary as a cult, you'd be waving their flags and you'd be fighting for them. Yeah. Going back to your question that I did answer before about things be changed, in my group, by deconstructing gender, all these assumptions of gender, all these assumptions of rules, by breaking them down within the group, they realized that they weren't persecuted by them. If these rules didn't exist, they didn't have to be persecuted by not fitting in. And then over time, they realized they didn't have a gender problem because the problem was in relation to a framework which you dismantle, so they don't have a problem. So by the time people left my group, they didn't have a gender problem. They were fine. And in the whole time I ran the service, less than 2% did any medical or surgical interventions. And those that didn't pretend to themselves that they were changing sex. They were saying, I'm just doing this just to sort of modify myself to whatever. Yeah. So it worked. Yeah. And my role wasn't to convince them not to do anything because they were adults. I didn't mind what they did. They do what they want. I wouldn't be able to work with kids because I'd know that what they were doing was potentially terrible. But with adults, it would be like, well, if you want to get a cobweb tattooed on your face, you can. I wouldn't. But, I just wanted them to think about it. So whatever they did, fine, up to them. I wouldn't do it, but if you want to, it's fine. But I want you to think about it. And I want to think about how you got to the understanding that that was a solution. rather than just giving them what they wanted.
Can I ask, when you were deconstructing gender in these groups, I mean, a new idea is the circular definition of gender, which is like, what is a woman? Anyone who identifies as a woman. It's like this ridiculous kind of
But that's
thing.
La La Land made by queer theories. Queer theory.
Correct.
I was unfortunate to base my master's dissertation on Judith Butler, queer theory, and a group analytic understanding of trans. And I read every single thing she'd written up to the point I did my dissertation, which was like torture. But what she wrote in Gender Trouble, I totally agree with. She talks about the performative nature of gender and how it's then every time she writes a book, she changes her mind, because the whole point of queer theory is you're queering everything. So everything you understand, you queer and turn on its head. But I don't think really, in the heart of hearts of the queer theorists, they thought it was a rule for living. I think they were just academically subverting things intellectually. But now you have these quite autistic people that are using it as rules for life. And queer theory was never meant to do that. Queer theory was just meant to be a thoughtful, provocative way of thinking.
Yeah.
It wasn't meant to be do this way. Oh, women don't exist, men don't exist. That's a ridiculous use of queer theory, and it's people who are not understanding the point of it. I'm not a queer theory advocate. I think it caused more problems than good. But the whole point of it is just an academic exercise. It's not meant to be lived out.
Yes, this is so it. This is so it. This is taking a thought experiment that's just supposed to get us, thinking about things and being curious. And then we return back to grounded reality. But you're right. I think this hyper literal, rigid thinking
That's
of the
autistic,
autistic
isn't it? That's
mind.
autistic.
Right.
Exactly. It's almost like they've picked up Judith Butler and they've gone, okay, this is the rule book. We'll do this. But
Yeah.
she changes her mind every book. Hello, look, everyone, look, she changes her mind. She's queering her own queer theory. And that's the beauty of queer theory, as long as you don't take it seriously as a manual for life. Because otherwise it's ridiculous.
So it's when
So did you
autists
ever
meet queer theory? That's the...
Stella talking to herself again. What did you say? Are you with us, Stella?
Please, sir, can I say something? I've had a thought.
If you must, Stella, go on. It's my podcast.
I'm entitled to thoughts. I think them all the time. And this thought is that arguably autistic people have met queer theory, and that is the perfect storm. That is the collision.
Oh, totally. Yeah. People who cannot think subversively or outside the box are introduced to queer theory, and of course, all they can do is take it literally. They can't do anything else with it. They can't be subversive.
God. This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion.
Well, okay, there's so much here. I also want to go back to something that I've heard you talk about. You actually mentioned this in our last episode together. I was asking you, how did you first start even thinking about this gender stuff? And you said, you were getting into psychiatry and you thought the idea of gender medicine or sex change was this interesting combination of like art and medicine, the sculptural, cosmetic. Is that fair to say? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, so I could never decide whether to do fine art or medicine. Because basically all I did at school was fine art. And I just managed to do some science A levels together. And so I applied for both. And my plan was to do both in order. And much to my parents' relief, I chose medicine to do first. And so I did medicine.
I'd say.
So I got there. My first job was in plastics, and I was helping do these sex change things. I was reading their notes, and I was saying, "It's amazing! You could turn men into women. This is like some wonderful. How on earth do you do that?" And then I was realizing actually they're just changing their bodies around, but what's happening in their heads? So I thought, well, hopefully psychiatry did psychiatry. Nobody was thinking about it, so that's why I became so interested in thinking about it. I went to the gender clinic. They weren't thinking either. They were ticking boxes and saying, "Are you sure? Okay, fine. Here's what you want." colluding with this notion, which I thought was very no one was thinking about. The whole point being a psychiatrist is about you're interested in the mind, but it was all mindless.
Yeah. And I mean, something Stella and I have often explored on this show is the way gender medicine operates almost like as a consumer based, give the patient what they want, which I think, my hypothesis, this would be much more ethical if it was treated as totally elective, cosmetic, aesthetic procedures.
As long as it was on the basis that you could men look in this sort of feminized way bodily, as long as they weren't fraudulently purporting then to be women, because I can have my face looking like a dragon, but I'm not a dragon. I've just changed how I look. So there's this misselling of fraud that people are then victim of because the medical profession is saying we can do this, but they can't really. They can do something, but it's not that.
Right.
But the problem is in societies that some people can really look, especially I think females can look really male. And
you can look like however. It doesn't mean you are that. It's like I said, it's like gender blackface. It's impersonation and aping, and you could. I used to live in a flat when I was a junior doctor upstairs from 3 lookalikes. Downstairs, I had Michael Jackson, Gloria Estefan, and Marilyn Monroe. And they were really realistic, but they weren't really them. I'd come home and somebody'd be doing I Am a Canto and Michael Jackson was moonwalking and Marilyn Monroe was in the white dress going up. They were really impressive and they looked just like, but they weren't Michael Jackson, Marilyn Monroe, and Gloria Estefan. They were just lookalikes.
Yeah. And I mean, in addition to what you're raising, Stella, that sometimes the cosmetic changes are somewhat convincing to others, I think there's kind of 2 more lies that are part of gender medicine that I'd love to ask you about. One is that within you, there is this genuine, authentic other self, and that medical procedures will actualize that. I think that's a total lie. And I think it's a total fallacy. And the fact that these cosmetic procedures come with serious, serious trade-offs, which people often have very distorted perceptions about. Like if you go into a lot of the Reddit threads, for example, FTM Reddit threads, they ask, sometimes people will say, hey, is it guaranteed that I'm going to have health complications? And a very common refrain is, you'll only have the same health risks as cis males. Like there's this crazy distortion of reality.
I mean, if you read the book, Sasha, if you buy the book, Sasha, first of all, and read it, I can give you one. If it's the money, I can give you one.
I have it.
Read it. So, if you read Richie's story in this, oh my God, it is so powerful and it's so upsetting because he was missold something and he's been dogged by complications ever since. He's regretted it, and irrespective of whether he regrets it or not, he's had multiple medical complications. And there's loads of people out there who are really struggling physically. As a psychiatrist, I'm interested in the mind, and the mis-selling is terrible. You talk to these young people and I say, but hang on, so you want to be a trans male, and don't you think that'll cause a problem in terms of relationships or dating? Because you're just not going to have a penis, and isn't that you're going to have a vagina? Is that a problem? And he's going, no, nobody cares about that anymore. I was going, don't they? He said, no, people don't care about genders anymore. And they're buying into this idea that, men can have vaginas, nobody minds. And, then you see these sort of conversations where people have gone to some sort of, gay orgy, and they're wondering why, whilst they're standing there naked in this room with their vagina, no gay man's going anywhere near them. And they're saying, what's this about? I've got a beard. And so the idea that sort of the innocent, naive acceptance of this propaganda is awful.
Could I ask on that?
You may, Stella. You may.
Thank you, sir. The gay male. Oh no, let me get this right. The female trans masculine. I'm very sick. I'm really not very.
Read it out.
So basically, the born female RODG kid, and she thinks she's a gay male, and she's going to these gay clubs, she's going to gay saunas, wherever she's going. Has it arrived in the scene? Because I've been waiting for it. We hear all the time from the lesbians that they're seeing the trans women on the lesbian apps. I'm not really hearing the equivalent on the other side. And I'm looking and I'm listening, and I know enough of these RODG kids, and they seem to kind of get together with each other.
I think they're being humoured, and I think they're being excluded. So I don't think, I don't think they're being thought to be males, or they're not being asked out on dates and things, but maybe they are. I don't know. But you do see some sort of, you see a lot of backlash to them going. I mean, there was someone on Twitter yesterday, this woman with hairy breasts and a beard, and she was complaining that nobody would have sex with her, and she was like begging, "Please, can somebody?" And it's just tragic, It's like, what has she been missold?
I'm just dying to hear from the 20-year-old gay males. What are they thinking? Because surely there must be significant numbers at this stage. We've been waiting and waiting.
I think they're just being excluded, and gay people are getting on as they are and excluding them, and in face to face they'll be humouring them, but
But I don't think they'll know. I don't think they'll know that they're a
well, they will at some point, won't they?
They will at some point.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the FTMs are just dating one another. I mean, that's the impression that I get, that they are very sensitive to like places where they feel validated and accepted, which kind of shrinks down their social network into the pro-trans with a bunch of other trans-identified kids. And I think they're dating each other. I think sometimes they're dating trans women. I mean, it's mostly, I think, trans-identified kids dating each other.
These heterosexual relationships where one of them is purporting to be the other sex, and so is the other one. So they're a man and a woman dating a man and a woman, but both pretend to be a woman and a man.
I met a guy recently. I was at some conference thing, and he said he knew I was interested in trans. And it was kind of funny. He said, I'm heterosexual, and I went out with a trans woman. And I said, oh, really, did you? And then I couldn't resist because I'm like that. And I said, so how's the sex? And he said, well, it was very difficult, to be honest. I said, was it? And he said, yeah. He said, it was very difficult. And he said, I was ideologically convincing myself to be with the trans woman, but I couldn't genitally get there. You know what I mean? So it was fascinating.
Or the other version is, because my trans patients said that they would go to all these these clubs like the Way Out Club and various clubs that used to exist that were for transvestites and transsexuals, and they said they'd be like fending off tranny chasers who are men who are sexually attracted to trans people, and they say, oh, we just want to go out with someone who sees us as a whatever sex they think they are. But of course, they're attracting all these fetishists who fetishize trannies, and so they called them tranny chasers. And that was the irony, was that was, yes, the state they were in was attracting people, but they were attracting people for real reasons and not for fantasy reasons. Their fantasy was they want to be seen as a woman, but in reality, obviously, they're a man. And they really were attracting people who saw them as a man presenting as a trans woman, but they didn't want that because that broke their plan, what they want people to see them as. So I was saying, does it matter? Because as long as they fancy you, they like you, doesn't that matter? No, but I wanted them to fancy me because of this. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, this kind of ties in with the point we were touching on earlier regarding cosmetic surgery and stuff, because I've been playing with this idea of just a reality-based identity versus a denial-based identity. And so much of what you're describing here, and you even mentioned that in the mixed groups that you used to run, a couple of people did go on to transition, but you said they were grounded in a realistic understanding of what they were doing and what medical outcomes they could expect. And you're describing...
So they chose to medicalize and surgically alter themselves to be trans people. They weren't trying to be women or men. They said, look, I'm not pretending to be a woman. I can never be a woman, but I can be a trans person, and I can, and they said my identity will be that as being trans, not as being woman or male. So they had a very realistic, grounded idea as to what they were going into. They thought about it for ages with me.
Well, this is interesting because this is a question that was posed to me after a talk at the recent GenSpec conference, and I hear you kind of alluding to two answers to it. The question was, why is it that some people start a medical transition and very quickly, pretty dramatically regret it and feel terrible and their whole world is shattered, versus others persist and maybe they don't really have any regrets about it? And I am identifying in our conversation so far, there's almost two types of people. The person who doesn't have very autistic thinking, they're very grounded in reality, they have clear understanding, they get
And
the nuances.
they may have a fetish, and those are the ones that
Okay.
regret it. The ones that are really autistic and not fetishistic, they're not transvestite or AGP, they're the ones that may not regret it.
But
But
I'm saying that
depending on their level of autism, they may later. So loads of my group said, they talked about this 7-year cycle, and they said, after 7 years, that's when even the transsexuals were beginning to question and regret. They came up, I don't know how they all seem to come up with the number 7 for some reason. They said there's a 7-year thing where they.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I guess
interesting.
I think that I suspect 7 years maybe has some correlation with the kinds of medical complications that crop up after that many years on, I don't know. Do you have any theories about why there is a honeymoon period, right, that researchers describe?
Yeah,
So
like I
why do
said,
you
like you
think
go
it's
from gender
around?
dysphoria to transgender idealism to transgender euphoria to then transgender
Yeah.
dysphoria.
Yeah. Why do you think 7 years?
I have no idea. This is what they told
Mm.
me. I learned from my patients.
You could say like a lot of religions, a lot of psychology, a lot of things goes in sevens, even mysticism and stuff like that. So you could
Stella's
say
gone
that,
all misty now.
and so you could say that there's a
What
kind
happened
of
to
a
Stella?
human. I'm ignoring you. There's a human kind of concept that goes towards the 7 days in a week.
I'm coming from an empirical, scientific, medical background. Stella's all coming from like mysticism or something.
And
Wishy-washy,
I
mumbo-jumbo,
think,
Stella.
yeah, but there has to be a space for where did all
That's like the
this
patient to say, I feel it in my waters that I'm a woman.
yeah. But there
Empirical and
is,
scientific.
I will
I'm
struggle
representing science.
on. There is something that makes a lot of psychological sense about 7 years being roughly the time that you go through a cycle of your job, your marriage, your, you know what I mean, whatever it is, the thing, which actually our producer gave this great quote. It's the concept of the overvalued idea. And she says it in your book. You said, at one stage, I thought the transsexual mindset was one of delusion and therefore psychosis. I revised this to realize that, as with anorexia, it is an overvalued idea, which is relentlessly pursued by the individual. I've actually read up a lot
She's
about
read
this.
the book, Sasha. She's read the book.
Yeah.
In
Well, the
between her
producer gave me
mumbo
that
jumbo,
line
she's
of
coming
proof.
out with sensible things from
No,
the book she's
it's
read.
true that I have not read it. I will totally admit that, but I do have it, is what I'm saying. I
The
own the
sensible
book.
bits that
It's on my
Stella's saying is the
list.
things I said.
Yeah, go back to this overvalued idea. It's very, very important. Myself and Mia Hughes have spoke about this in kind of quite big
So
detail.
just for your viewers who don't know what that is.
Yes.
So phenomenologically, a delusion is a fixed false belief. So if Stella thought that she was, a car, and she
Okay.
believed she was a car beyond any doubt, then she'd be delusional. And if you have a delusion or a hallucination, you're psychotic. If Stella thought, I really feel I should be a car, and my life would be better if I was a car, I'd love to be a car, then she doesn't believe it. She's really invested into this idea. So it's an overvalued idea. So it's a
Okay.
bit like delusion light. And so we see overvalued ideas in anorexia. The anorexic person doesn't believe they're fat. They really think they should be thinner, and their fear of being fat. So if you have the belief that you actually are the opposite sex, then obviously it's a delusion, but most of them realize they're not, but they think they should be.
And what do we do if we are trying to treat somebody with an overvalued idea? Where do we go with this as a therapist?
You don't include them. The anorexic says, I really need to lose more weight. You don't go, okay then, and watch them drop down dead because they've starved themselves. The suicidal person says, I really think I need to kill myself because my pain will end. You go, well, it won't really, because you just won't be alive, and you won't be alive to exist, the relief, and that's a notion that you've got. So you untangle how they got there, and you critique it, and you come from an objective point of view, listening to what they're saying and unpicking it. What you don't do is just collude with it. And with gender, we're just colluding with it. There are schools in London where children are being identified as pterodactyls and cats, and they're not going. The teachers aren't going, why on earth do you think you're a pterodactyl? They're ridiculous. They're not, because they're too scared to. They're going, yes, you're a pterodactyl. It's been extinct for millions of years. So you don't collude. You critique, question, challenge, and try and understand.
I think that if we leaned into seeing trans identity as an overvalued idea, I think that would clarify an awful lot of the frankly rubbish that we're doing. I
So
think it
I'd
really
say the
be
majority of
good.
psychiatrists believe it is no valid idea. So the psychiatrists who work in gender clinics are outliers. They are a spurious group who do not represent psychiatry. And most psychiatry has nothing to do with gender patients because they're too scared. So they outsource it to gender clinics who are a subsample of psychiatrists who all are bought into this ideology. So if you do a survey of most psychiatrists, they will say they'll agree it's no valid idea. And in fact, we tried to ask the Royal College of Psychiatrists, or a very embarrassing college that's very captured. We tried to ask them whether they would do a survey for members if we wrote the survey. They refused because they probably knew that their ideological stance would be questionable by most members. I don't know any psychiatrist who doesn't work in a gender clinic who doesn't agree with
Yeah.
gender critical ways of thinking. They just don't want to say it because they don't want their lives to be ruined by the trans terrorists.
A lot of, I agree with you to a point, but a lot of psychiatrists, I remember myself and yourself, I think, as we're at that CAN SG conference in March, and I spoke to a very eminent psychiatrist there at the time. I can't think of his name, but he said what so many people who aren't working in the field said, which was, oh, yeah, 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 but there is a very, very small number that is trans, if you follow me. And a little
Look,
part of me dies inside when they say this.
I think they're hoping not to be completely let down by the profession over all these years to have got something wrong.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a trans person. There's either
Which is an
autistic,
overvalued idea in
yeah,
themselves. Like,
there's there's either an autistic person who's come to this proxy solution, or there's a confused child. But nobody's born in the wrong body. The fact that they cannot say what it is that makes them in the wrong body convincingly is proof enough. But nobody questions it. They just say the questions they're asked are you sure? Are you still sure? Do you still want it? Okay. And they rule out any schizophrenia or depression or anything. And it's just a case of, are you sure? Are you sure? Do you want it? Do you still want it? Okay, that's it. That's that. So the general public have this false belief that they're delusional, or maybe it's no valid idea, that people who are given sex changes are given very in-depth sort of scrutiny.
Yeah.
Not at all. That's an overvalid idea by society. They hope and believe that they are. None of my regretters had any scrutiny at all. They were just given what they wanted. And they all said, why on earth did we not have this group where it critiqued and challenged our thinking before we did it? Because we wouldn't have done it then.
Yeah, I definitely think that the lay person who's not in this work believes there's some incredibly rigorous, super deep and complex evaluation process or even therapeutic process, but none of that happens.
None of
And
it.
even in like
The only therapy they have is affirmative therapy. And I
correct.
sit in on some of this, and it's like, oh, where's the best place to have electrolysis? Oh, there's a place down the road. What can I do about a driving license? So there's not therapy.
Yeah.
It's like a support help group on how to do it. So but having that, they go, oh, we've been through lots of therapy. No, you haven't. You've gone through a supportive process of where people are colluding with you and helping you. That's not exploratory therapy.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that this has been lumped in as a sense of personal identity that only the patient can tell the clinician, that in and of itself is almost, I think, the crux of the problem. And you've been in the field for a long time. My impression is that it was a little more gatekeepy in the past, but there's always been a threat of this, right? That it's up to the gender dysphoric patient to really explain to the clinician or the provider who they are, how they've seen themselves. And even the most, quote, rigorous evaluations are kind of like, how long have you felt like you like playing with those toys and these toys? Like, I mean, they're really pathetic questions, but you've obviously seen the field change over time.
So what I've seen is the rigor getting less, and
Wow.
so in the past you had to live in the opposite sex role, whatever that means, 2 years, and then have hormones, and then have surgery. So there were periods of time where you could pull out. But now I don't know a single patient who's been to a private gender clinic who has not got hormones on the first day. And the gender clinic person says, oh, well, you've clearly lived like this for a long time. So they get on the first day. And I've had parents who said that their 18-year-old kid has gone to some clinic with no money, but the clinic has given him hormones on day one and a loan to cover further appointments and a loan for the future surgery. I mean, if that's not really a perverse way of doing medicine, it's a bit like an anorexic going and getting Ozempic.
Yeah.
Some doctors are not ethically and morally in the same field as other ones. You wouldn't give an anorexic Ozempic, even if they really wanted it.
We're coming towards the end. Is there a way for parents to kind of reach? You gave all the different categories of, the trans-identified person. Is there a way that you think that parents should come at it? Because we talked about the overvalued idea, which is not to collude. It's to critically go in. Is that what you would say the parents should do too?
So my advice to parents, and I've stopped seeing gender people because the climate is so difficult, and I think I've done enough of that. And now I spend my time doing things like this and talking about it. I love talking. My advice to parents is don't get into a battle. So don't do a yes, you are, no, you're not, black and white, male and female. So what I would do with patients is I try and come across as an inquiring, curious, trying to understand. So how did you, so this is your solution. How did you get there? And show me how it made sense for you to get to the conclusion. Because they just want to talk to you about the conclusion, the solution. Whereas what you want to do is work out how they got from here to here. So invite them to go back and show you step by step. And often these people came to this conclusion and didn't revisit their working through. And by doing that, you can see chinks of irrationality or illogicality in their argument. And those are the opportunities to go, oh, really? So hang on. So what about this then? So if you're not confronting, but inquisitively challenging and inquiring from a perspective of someone who's really interested and likes them and wants to understand, because I don't know anything about it, but you clearly have thought about it a lot. So help me understand by showing me your thinking of how you got through it. And then by doing it, they themselves may see that their argument is slightly flawed. And also the parents should read this book because everything sensible that Stella says was come out of this book.
I contributed a chapter to it. I'm very proud to be part of it. Yeah, it's a really good book, and it's amazing. I read your book in 2018, Trans, and this is deep.
This is much better. My trans book was very diplomatic.
5 years later. Yeah.
It was very diplomatic and because it was published by a charity and they didn't want to be too outspoken. This was just me
straight in there,
just not beating around the bush and saying what I really think. Yeah.
And, I'd love to, as we continue this into our extended conversation, I can hear parents saying to me, I've tried to go through the logic with my kid, but here's the troubleshooting that I get into. So maybe we can touch on that in the follow-up. So obviously we will include both of your books. One of which I've purchased, both of which, okay, just that one. The D-Trans is the most important.
This trumps the last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything else that you want to kind of...
It's called D-Trans, but it's not just about detransition. It's a critique of the whole gender ideology. It's debunking the myths that the activists want you to believe. So don't think, it's about D-Trans. It's not. This is about all gender ideology.
Okay. That's great. And I'm so glad that you were able to, in the second book, really say more of what you think. That's I'm sure you felt a lot of freedom in being able to do that.
Yeah.
Anything else you want our listeners or audiences to check out?
This Stella's plant. I mean, what is it?
Yeah, I know. I'm visually, thank you, Az, for lifting this up. I don't have a good sense of the aesthetic. I'm going to keep talking, and I changed rooms, and I thought, don't do this, Stella, without somebody
Stella's actually doing advice. It from a
and so I did, and then Az came in and started laughing at me. This is my life.
Maybe put some pictures on the wall or something.
I know, yeah. I just thought it'd be grand. I keep on thinking that. I've been thinking that all my life. Like, it'd be grand. Nobody will notice. And then they do.
You're blending in too much with the walls.
But I want to ask one question. Is there anything you'd recommend on Netflix or any books, any podcasts that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I think the Wider Lens podcast is very good.
So do we.
I did a podcast with Andrew Gold when I was at the Battle of Ideas. So obviously
he's fascinating.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean,
what about something not about you? Anything generally?
Netflix or any sort of films?
Well, look at Richie Herron's Substack. I mean, that's traumatizing.
Okay.
And get any kids who are thinking about it just to read that. I don't know about Netflix. I don't think I haven't got Netflix. I mean, I'm still on BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and S4C, Channel Panorama.
Wow.
I watch Welsh television a lot of the time.
Good for you. You're into Welsh language and I'm into the Irish language.
I am Welsh. We do the Cymru.
Oh, my far. Oh, come on.
Speaking in tongues again. She's sitting
Wait,
in the
you
side.
guys can understand each other?
No, he spoke Welsh and I spoke Irish.
Stella's talking in tongues in her board singing.
Oh, you should speak Arabic, Sasha.
أنا هتكلم بالعربي دلوقتي. Okay, ما فيش مشكلة خالص. Okay, great.
طيب
Now we're all confusing everyone.
Okay, well, we'll say Slán, Yaki da. Is that right?
Okay, مع السلامة.
Well vowed.
Okay.
And we'll move into the other piece.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.